Hey, I think we will kick things off. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the annual Kepler Cheuvreux ESG conference. My name is Anastasios Adamopoulos, and I'm an ESG analyst at Kepler Cheuvreux. I'm very happy to be launching our conference today, where the theme this year is ESG after 2022, transition accelerating. To help us navigate through this obviously broad topic, we have 6 live sessions today with 9 experts and keynote speakers who are going to share their insights on different kinds of issues, including biodiversity, investment opportunities, decarbonization from the demand side, data protection risk, and other topics. Also, you will have the opportunity, as you will know, to meet with the over 60 corporates that are attending today and to understand what they are doing. But I think it's fitting that we actually kick things off today with a discussion on the challenges and implications of corporate climate disclosures. I assume that many of you will have experienced this or will know that the data from these disclosures can be invaluable, both for the companies who use them to actually decarbonize and for investors like yourselves. But the topic is particularly timely now because of the recently introduced regulations like the EU Taxonomy and incoming ones like the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which should in theory bring greater transparency in areas where we are still lacking information, as we will expect to hear today, particularly in key areas like Scope 3 emissions. And I'm very pleased to say that we have 2 experts in this field with us today. We have with us today Sylvain Vaston. He's the Executive Director for Climate Investment Research at MSCI, and he helps formulate essentially the research agenda for the MSCI's climate-related content and works with clients on a number of relevant issues like climate risk reporting, risk management, portfolio management, climate metrics, biodiversity, just to name a few. He is also represents MSCI on several key climate-related organizations like the TCFD, the GFANZ, and the SBTI. And we are also joined by Guilherme Cassaro, who is Senior Policy Officer at the CDP. Guilherme works on essentially translating the latest regulatory requirements that the EU poses on companies, and is very well versed on issues like the taxonomy and its integration in the CDP disclosure system, which many of you will have likely used. Now, we will have a half-hour discussion with Guilherme and Sylvain, followed by 15 minutes for questions from you. And the way in which you can ask the questions is to type them in the chat, the Zoom chat, and we will try to get to as many as possible in that 15-minute period. Now, to kick things off, Sylvain, I will start with you, because you recently published your latest net zero tracker, where you essentially, as the title is self-explanatory, but you track what companies are doing with regards to net zero targets. Where do we stand when it comes to corporate disclosures on emissions and targets today?
Sure. Thank you, Anastasios. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to this event. I'm glad to be here. So indeed, we published recently our 7th net zero tracker. And the tracker focuses usually on the world of listed issuers, so listed corporates. We usually look at the sample, which is called ACWI-IMI, that is MSCI's broadest listed universe of about 10,000 issuers. Now that we've reached the 7th edition, I think we can sort of step back and think about the trends. And what we see is pretty clear now in this latest edition is that we have more climate commitments, improved disclosures, which is good, but ever-growing carbon emissions. So of course, the opposite would have been better, less emissions and less commitments, but that's the world we're in. And maybe I can give you a few interesting figures. I picked a few from the tracker, which is actually a public document. It's not just for our clients. So for example, out of the ACWI-IMI sample, so which is basically the world's economy, the world's 10,000 largest listed companies, both emerging markets and developing markets. 44% have set some kind of a decarbonization target, which is actually up 8% versus our previous tracker. So that is pretty good. And of those, 17% are approved by SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative, again, up by 10% versus the previous edition. I think this is really, really good because getting an SBTi stamp of approval is really hard. In a previous job, I was in charge of this. It's really, really hard. It's really demanding. It's not everybody can achieve this. And 35% of listed companies have disclosed at least some of the emissions from their value chain, which we usually call scope 3. It can be upstream or downstream, which is slightly improving year after year. Again, 35%, I think this is not bad because disclosing as a corporate, I know there's a lot of corporates in the room, disclosing scope 3 emissions is really hard. Again, you have to collect information on the impacts of your products, on the emissions of your supply chains. So it is actually pretty difficult to do this. So 35%, nice one. But the emissions are going up, as I said. So think about the world's global emissions are 60.2 gigatons in 2023. So obviously that's a forward-looking estimate. And 11.2 gigatons will be listed issuers' emissions. So it's about 1/6 of the world's emissions are those 10,000 issuers. And at the current rate of emissions, those issuers, those corporates will burn their entire 1.5-degree carbon budget by October 2026, just a few months away. And not only is this quite soon, just a few years away, it's also 2 months earlier than what we found in the previous tracker. So time is slipping away faster than time. Of course, it's not as if suddenly come October 2026 and it's the end of the world, but it just gives us an idea of how carbon budgets work. And a lot of our clients, so our clients are only asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurers, basically large investors. This is the kind of budgets that they work with to define their portfolio strategies. And if we take all of these issuers together, using a metric that was designed by MSCI called implied temperature rise, and I think we should come back to this metric. It's interesting. The world's listed issuers align with the world of 2.7 degree warming by the end of this century, which is interesting again because that metric is just based on a sophisticated aggregation of carbon budgets, but we end up in the same prediction as using the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions submitted to COPs. So it seems that ITR works. And using again implied temperature rise, or ITR, we find that 19% of the ACWI-IMI index are already in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So already below 1.5 degree ITR, which is again quite good. And I think this is actually quite an achievement. We also looked in the latest edition of the tracker at the differences between listed and non-listed corporates, because we worked with one of our partners called Burgess, who collects a lot of typically private equity infrastructure data. And it was counterintuitive. We tend to think that a lot of emissions hide in private assets rather than publicly listed assets. But that's not what we found. On a comparable basis, unlisted companies in the 5 most emissions intensive industry groups were actually less carbon intensive than their listed counterparts. This was quite a surprise for me and for the researchers. And also, one last thing interesting, US American private investors are actually slightly less carbon intensive than their European counterparts. It's not that they're better or less good. It's just that, they tend to be more invested in tech when European private investors are more invested in infrastructure. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that you see in the net zero tracker. So there's one every 3 months. But what we see really is quite clear, at least for investors who tend to be our usual audience. It's pretty clear what the equation for investors is. They can either address transition risks today, and that is a steep road, or face severe and irreversible physical risks tomorrow. So these are the kinds of dilemmas that many of our clients are I wouldn't say playing with, but are faced with.
Okay, some very, very interesting insights there. And maybe I was a bit harsh in saying we're lacking on scope 3, because you did say it's 35% is a good, I guess.
It's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. And obviously we will come back to the value of that information. But Guilherme, I want to ask you, because we just spoke about a sort of essentially disclosures that companies make, which are still very much, especially I would say globally in the EU too at the moment, still on the voluntary side when it comes to being sort of thorough and touching on all angles of climate disclosure. I think what is interesting in the EU is the incoming, or what is now in effect, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will bring in real requirements for companies operating in the EU. I guess from your side, because you have insight to this, what do you expect to be the actual main benefits of this regulation, aside perhaps from telling us, more about how much each company emits?
Thank you so much. Also super happy to be here. Good morning. Good morning, Sylvain. I'll try to keep it short so that we also have some time for questions at the end. But, well, I think the main benefit from the CSRD is basically enhancing data availability to investors and enhancing accuracy in that data that is reported. So basically what the CSRD is doing is that it's filling a gap between the SFDR regulation and what investors have at hand to report on the so-called PAI, so principal adverse impacts of their investments. So the SFDR regulation was introduced back in 2019, and it asked investors and investment funds to track their principal adverse impacts on the environmental objectives of the European Union. These principal adverse impacts are very similar to the principle of do no significant harm, which is present both at the CSRD regulation as it is in the EU Taxonomy. And what the CSRD is bringing into play here is information that was missing in this scene on this adverse impacts. So the companies will start reporting now on we expect from sometime this end of this year. There's an incoming public consultation on the ESRS, so the European standards for reporting. We expect this consultation to start anytime this month in June. And after public consultation, the standards should be live. And once the standards are live, we have a clear picture of what companies need to be reporting on. It's not entirely set yet that the standards will remain the same as they were presented originally by EFRAG. They are currently a bit under threat, let's say, of becoming a bit watered down. But on the CDP side, we highly encourage the European Union to keep the ambition levels that were presented originally by EFRAG, because we understand they represent the best practice in environmental reporting from companies. So yeah, I think that's the main benefit, bridging this data gap between what investors need to be reporting on and what companies are mandated to be reporting on.
Okay, hopefully, like you said, we will get some more clarity on that soon. And we've touched on the importance of data with these first couple of questions, but Sylvain, I'm curious if you think, and this is very relevant to the people in the audience, but do you think investors are actually utilizing, the data that is becoming available sufficiently? Could they be using it in a better way? You already mentioned sort of climate alignments there, but for you, could they be actually utilizing the available data in the better way? And beyond emissions data, what other things do you see investors being interested in?
Yeah, sure. There is a deluge of data, and CSRD, of course, is going to increase the quantity and the quality of data. And Obviously, for people like MSCI, data service provider, this is absolutely essential. And of course, for our clients who pay, dearly to get this data, this is absolutely essential for them to define adequate investment strategies, portfolio strategies, better understand their risks, etc. I mean, after all, let's go back to COP15 COP21 in 2015 with the launch of the TCFD. This was the main theory of change. With better data, the markets will better integrate climate change. It's partly achieved, but not. It's still insufficient. So we've spoken about emissions data, but actually climate metrics can differ substantially in terms of scope, objectives, and applicability. It's not just emissions. So it's important for investors to select the right set of metrics to support them in meeting their own objectives. They also consider different metrics at different stages of their climate investment journey. So that of course makes the whole challenge a bit more complicated. But generally speaking, the first questions that I ask to clients when I meet with clients is, are they impact driven or risk driven? Because that's really two different things. So you have to distinguish between climate metrics that measure either climate impact, so the impact of my portfolios on climate change, on global warming generally, and those that measure outside in climate risk on my portfolios. So climate impact metrics are either directly measured as a temperature impact. So I mentioned implied temperature rise, but most of our competitors, but also open source bodies, including the CDP, also have their own sort of temperature rating models, which I think are a very interesting model. And these obviously have some kind of explanatory power for temperature rise in the atmosphere. But there's also scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, etc. And then you have metrics that assess climate risk. And so these are trying to estimate the potential financial gains or losses, usually losses, as a proportion of a company's, for example, enterprise value, exposed to climate risk. So at MSCI, for example, we have a metric which is very much used by our clients called climate value at risk, CVAR, that takes into account risks and opportunities, physical risk, transition risks, etc., based on certain climate scenarios, usually the NGFS scenarios. So these metrics, they are aggregate metrics. They're not just like, tons of carbon. They take a lot of considerations into account. They need a lot of explanation, and they need, powerful engines to make them running, but they are very, very useful. And then you also need to understand if climate metrics are measuring the current state of companies or portfolios, or metrics that provide some sort of a forward-looking projection of the climate impact or climate risk. So this is really the kinds of challenges that our investors are faced with. To be honest, a lot of them are lost in translation, especially the smaller investors who are starting their climate journey like just quite recently, sometimes because there's a mandate that it's mandatory recently in their own through their own local regulator, or just because they took time to catch up the climate investment train. But for those who are most sophisticated, of course, they understand the differences between those metrics, and they actually, use them for portfolio risk assessment, asset allocation, target setting, etc. So to come back to what Guilherme was saying, CSRD, of course, and the PAIs will feed into our work. It's already started. So the work of MSCI, what we do really for our clients, for example, is to translate what the EU, what EFRAG, for example, is doing into meaningful metrics for our clients. We don't do investment advice, but we provide the data for our clients to make, useful investment decisions.
And Sylvain mentioned there essentially, how sometimes this data can be lost in translation, especially maybe for investors who are new in this field. And I think that ties into one of the key data points for emissions, and that is scope 3 emissions and action on that front. And Guilherme, when you sort of look at action on scope 3 emissions, what are the companies that are best managing scope 3 emissions doing best that others can learn from? And I think, if we're looking at this from an investor perspective, how do you identify those companies maybe that are doing best in that front?
Yes, I think Sylvain also touched upon this. I think first step is accounting. So first step, which you'd be surprised with how many companies haven't started yet, but really accounting and verifying their scope 3 emissions is the most important first step to understanding where your scope 3 emissions lie within the different categories of scope 3 emissions. Second step would be to include the scope 3 emissions in your reduction strategy, so in your GHG reduction strategy, and prioritizing. So selecting the most significant scope 3 categories and then prioritizing those categories for reducing your emissions. Step 3, which perhaps is the most important one, is to set science-based targets for your scope 3 emissions. So most companies have now set scope 1 and scope 2 science-based targets, but a lot of companies haven't included their scope 3 in their science-based targets. So this is a really important step that I think also investors can have a look at when they want to actually see the companies that are taking proper action on scope 3. And then step 4 would be to include these targets within your governance structure. So to incentivize the leadership of your company, sometimes even monetarily, so attaching the achievement of these targets to bonuses of the leadership of a company. So setting proper procurement strategies to really encourage their suppliers to reduce emissions. Contrarily to a little bit to the picture that Sylvain pointed out in the beginning on the net zero target setting, CDP released a supply chain report last year that pointed that only 1 in 10 companies includes climate-related requirements in their supplier contracts. It's quite a dire picture.
I think it's not the same universe, though, because CDP is broader than listed, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a bigger sample of companies, includes small and medium size. So definitely, if we look only at the biggest companies, the picture is a little bit better for sure. Then we come to another metric. So in terms of incentivizing their suppliers to set science-based targets, we have only 0.04% of companies incentivizing their suppliers to set science-based targets.
Okay, that's very low.
To sort of link it to the ESRS as they were originally presented, we do expect that the ESRS will incentivize companies to put targets on their suppliers, as 92% of the European emissions come from scope 3. So basically, I think this is one of the main benefits also of the CSRD, that it will incentivize companies to take action also on scope 3 emissions and setting targets on their suppliers and so on.
Okay, but some very interesting and also concerning numbers that you mentioned there. I think bigger picture, perhaps, scope 3 is obviously key, but bigger picture, when we look at sort of where we are today beyond disclosures, Sylvain, we've obviously seen a lot of investors commit to reductions and emissions reduction and net zero outcomes, but we're also seeing some friction when it comes to commitments to alliances that we thought, we're going to perhaps change things. For example, we've seen recently some insurers exit the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Could you tell us a little bit, basically, and I think this is important for investors to hear about what these Net Zero Alliances and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, what is essentially their usefulness, and what happens really if the commitments that the investors have made do not materialize and the world does not decarbonize?
Yeah, that's a key question beyond disclosure, indeed. And friction is a euphemism for crisis. But I'd also like to, pay homage to the CDP. Guilherme, I think you're going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the CDP this year. Wasn't it launched in 2003? Long time ago. I mean, if the CDP wasn't there, I think we would have a lot less data to play with, and data comes before targets. So what's those, net zero alliances? There's been a lot of climate-related alliances and coalitions since quite a few years now. But the really new thing, that the new concept that the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which was the first Net Zero Alliance, launched in the summer of 2019, was an alliance with a requirement to set a hard target on your investments, decarbonization target, of course. And this was really the first time, as far as I can remember, the first time that you had an alliance with voluntary members that voluntarily commit to not just disclose, because that's hard enough, but anybody can do it with a little bit of, with a little bit of work, anybody can do it, but a commitment to decarbonize your portfolios, in this case for asset owners. So the first members, of course, were mostly pension funds, a few sovereign wealth funds, but mostly insurers in their capacity as institutional investors. And the concept was actually very well designed. At the time, I used to work at the AXA Group, so AXA joined immediately. And the NZAOA grew significantly since then and has become a very important voice in climate finance. But of course, quite quickly, the asset managers banded together to form the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative. Don't know why it's not an alliance, but it's an initiative. And then the banks formed the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And then, of course, and at the time, as I said, I was working in the insurance industry, we decided to launch the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Now with MSCI, we've also launched the Net Zero Financial Services Providers Alliance. It's a bit longer, longer acronym. And all of these alliances are housed, so to speak, under GFANZ, so the Glasgow Financial for Net Zero, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which provides a little bit of homogeneity and sanity checks in those alliances, and also, of course, provides an even bigger strength in numbers, if you want to say. Several things in common with all of those alliances. They have defined accounting protocols and target setting protocols. The Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance a few months ago published its third target setting protocol, and those documents are pretty lengthy, fairly technical documents that explain all of the commitments that the members either absolutely have to do, so there's must-dos, otherwise you're kicked out, basically, and nice to do, which are strongly encouraged. And so it's clear that when you do this, you commit voluntarily to set a number of constraints in your own investment or financing or insurance business, because in the short run, these are constraints. Decarbonizing your banking portfolios, your asset allocation, your insurance business is actually a constraint in the short run, in the belief that in the long run it will make you a better investor, a better insurer, a better banker, of course, because you are supporting not just today's economy but tomorrow's economy. Now, the friction with the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Why the Insurance Alliance? I mean, it's a bit surprising. It was launched, the Insurance Alliance was launched formally just last summer, so not even a year ago in Zurich. And it was, a very credible launch with the right set of protocols and governance. AXA chairs the alliance. Swiss Re is also a key member of the alliance, and so on. They produced, of course, a target setting protocol. It was launched in Q1 this year, which is very interesting, very detailed. And they also produced, through a partnership with another organization called PCAF, which, if the audience doesn't know, PCAF is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And these are the carbon accounting experts that a lot of organizations like MSCI, but like the investors, rely on to define how to attribute carbon emissions to a loan, to corporate debt, or to an insurance contract. Because when the Insurance Alliance was launched, it was not easy to define, well, to what extent is an insurer responsible for the emissions of its clients? If you're insuring just, a small part of that business, then what are you responsible for? If you're insuring, property commercial lines insurance is obviously very different from health or from liability insurance. So these are the questions that the Insurance Alliance worked on with PCAF to define attribution frameworks and so on. But then several attorney generals from Republican states in America sent a formal letter to the Net Zero Insurance Alliance not that long ago, saying that they were breaching antitrust regulations, at least in America, and explaining that basically this was most likely to be unlawful. And of course, several members have left. Munich Re was the first big one to leave, and then Swiss Re left. And I thought, well, this is quite something. And then just last week, AXA, which is the chair, left. So it's clear that something very serious is happening. Now, why the Insurance Alliance rather than, I don't know, the Asset Owner Alliance? My guess is that quite simply the insurance capacity in the market is actually smaller than the investment capacity in the market. So if you are, if you're a corporate and your shareholders, some of them leave you, you can usually easily replace them to some extent. If your bankers leave you, it's more trouble, but you can find replacements. If your insurers, especially on highly technical risks in the oil and gas industry, for example, start to leave you, then there is really a risk to your license to operate. So that, I think, is the logic behind the letter that was sent to the Alliance. And the fact that a lot of them have left, and it's quite possible, of course, that the Alliance is de facto over, although it's too early to say, frankly. There's still quite a few members staying in, means that maybe we have reached the limits of voluntary climate action. And maybe more importantly, I think that regulators should really have a strong rethink on competition law. Because if antitrust can be used as a weapon against voluntary climate initiatives, then I think we're all in trouble. So that's an interesting lesson learned from the NZIA demise. And I hope, of course, it can be reborn in a better state. But the good news is that all of the insurers who have left the Alliance have stated that they remain committed to the goals of the Alliance. It's just maybe they have thought that it's safer for them to continue working individually rather than collectively, which is a big reversal compared to what has been going on lately.
Yeah, and we will see what the implications are in due course. But okay, some very interesting points there, especially on the antitrust side. If I move it now on to the audience questions, again, whoever has a question can put it in the Zoom chat. Guilherme, I want to ask you. People want to know about the impacts of the EU taxonomy, especially now that we've sort of had the full first year of alignment reporting. And just as a preamble, we've seen companies essentially say, we're not sure this is very useful. We've seen industries complain. And on the other side, we've also seen NGOs say that the rules are too lax for some sectors. From your, they ask from your insights, what will the taxonomy really be useful for? Is there something in particular investors should be paying attention to?
Perfect. I think the taxonomy needs to be seen as a tool rather than just a reporting burden or a reporting obligation. It's an imperfect tool as it stands right now. We do know that, we understand that, but the important fact is that these flaws are being corrected through time based on the feedback that is received from companies and investors. So it's an imperfect tool, but a very important tool. The taxonomy was introduced basically to avoid greenwashing and direct investment to where it's mostly needed for the climate transition. So this is where the taxonomy really fits in. So the taxonomy should be financing companies' climate transition plans. What is a climate transition plan? How do you make it credible? So in order to have this clarity, the EU introduced the EU Taxonomy, and the EU Taxonomy should give companies a direction on the activities that they are doing that can be classified as actual green activities. This means that when a company wants to finance for example, a new project that will actually lower their emissions or help them transition to a lower emissions economy, they should be able to gather investment based on the EU taxonomy. So as long as these activities that they are implementing are aligned with the EU taxonomy, they should receive investment on it. I think for investors, it's also important to realize that it's currently being worked on, so it's not all sectors that are represented by the EU taxonomy right now. It's not all the activities, which doesn't mean necessarily that an activity which is not embedded in the taxonomy at this point in time is not helping the climate transition. So this is a work in progress. The SFDR, there's a consultation, there's a public consultation on the SFDR at this point in time, which aims to really classify the principle of do no significant harm, the thresholds, the methodologies, and this will help further to define what are the actual rules for defining what do no significant harm is. And with that further clarity, it enhances the applicability of the EU taxonomy. So it's a tool, it's being worked on, and it's a very important tool to finance the green transition.
Okay, yeah, definitely should be on the lookout for changes to the taxonomy and the SFDR. Yeah,
let me just add one point that CDP is currently collecting data on companies' position. So one of the questions that the CDP questionnaire, which we've introduced this year, asks companies about their activity level alignment with the EU taxonomy. We are collecting this data, and I think it fills a huge gap in the market right now that we currently don't know how companies are adapting to the EU taxonomy. For the corporates that are watching us at this moment, I highly encourage you to respond to these questions. We've introduced a lot of guidance on how to respond and how to address these questions. And I am also available if there's a need for further guidance on how to approach the questions. I'm happy to talk to you. I guess we will share our contacts by email later on with the presentations. So happy to address these questions, and please do respond to our new taxonomy questions in the questionnaire.
Great, thanks for that, Guilherme. And we have an interesting question here about a topic we haven't discussed. And so I'll pass this over to you. Okay. What do you think of Scope 4 and having a relative assessment of the products?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Scope 4 is, at least as far as I know about Scope 4, is all about how do you measure avoided emissions. So Scope 1, direct emissions, Scope 2, usually electricity, Scope 3, value chain, Scope 4, avoided emissions. So of course, there are some products that are said to be avoiding emissions somewhere else. So how do you account for this? There is no market guidance for Scope 4. There's been some publications that looked into this, like the IGCC. I don't think PCAF has worked on this yet. It's on the radar, of course, but it's not done yet. GFANZ was supposed to work on this at some point, but decided that there were other priorities for 2023. So this means that, for example, as far as my clients are concerned, they ask us quite frequently, how can I take into account, for example, you're an impact investor. You invest mostly in, I don't know, renewables, electric vehicles, regen ag, etc. How do you take into account the avoided emissions? Right now, we don't have adequate market guidance to do this. And we avoid having our own, cooking to do this, because then it becomes obsolete. And once it's integrated in indices and standard solutions used in portfolio strategies, then it's a big problem if it becomes obsolete. So we clearly need market guidance on Scope 4, but it's far from easy. I mean, how do you evaluate the avoided emissions of a vegetarian burger? How do you evaluate, the displacement of biofuels compared to fossil fuel, etc. So it does need a very thorough accounting approach. And let's be honest, when in 2018, the high-level expert group on sustainable finance said, we need a taxonomy of green activities, none of us thought that it would be so complicated to produce the EU taxonomy several years later. And as Guilherme said, it's still imperfect. So simple things like let's factor avoided emissions can actually be very complicated and raise very, significant methodological questions. I don't think it's impossible. And I think, acceptable compromises will be found, but we haven't reached that stage yet.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. Guilherme, is there anything you want to add on this subject, or shall I move on to the next question?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely very interesting because it's in many ways uncharted territory, as Sylvain just explained. I do want to ask, and this could be for either of you. Someone says, how reliant are companies in Europe at the moment on carbon offsets to reduce their the emissions in their own value chain, and what are the implications of this? Anyone want to have a go?
I don't have data at hand just now.
Okay.
I mean, I'd have to look it up. So obviously that's a bit annoying. But I don't know, Guilherme, if you have data about this.
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's how reliant are companies in Europe at the moment on carbon offsets to reduce the emissions in their own value chain, and what are the implications?
To be honest, I also don't have data on this. We at CDP usually, I mean, carbon offsets is not a type of activity that we incentivize. We're actually incentivizing more rather the action in itself of reducing emissions rather than offsetting them. So I don't even think that CDP is actually currently collecting this type of data, so wouldn't be able to help there.
I mean, we do collect it. It's just I don't have the data. What I can say is that in some industries, the reliance typically on CCS and other forms of carbon offset is very significant and is probably overly optimistic, and it's most probably not going to happen. So that's a long way to say it's not working. And we've seen recently from recent controversies in the offset market that there's significant governance concerns in that industry. Generally, we don't really take into account carbon offsets. Most of our clients actually don't really do this either. I would, however, differentiate with carbon removals, which are much more pricey, much more difficult to do, and much smaller, of course, for now. But carbon removals, yes. Carbon offsets, no.
Okay, very interesting. And I think it's worth just highlighting here that the Commission has proposed a regulation in the past couple of months that targets greenwashing. And companies would need
offsets will be in the middle of this.
And companies will need to clearly identify sort of within their targets how much of this is accounted for by offsets rather than reductions. So I think if that is to go through, we're going to get a lot of insight
that will
there.
Be helpful.
Look, and maybe just as a last question, just for a quick one, last couple of minutes, about the quality of the reporting. Like you said, there's a barrage of information coming in. How does are we currently at a stage where there's a reporting burden on stakeholders? This includes investors and companies. And does that affect essentially the quality of the reporting that comes in? Or are we at a stage where it's great that we have this much and we're getting more?
There's a huge reporting burden, let's be honest. It's hard these days to be a corporate reporting on everything that is expected from you, for your investors, for the CDP, for regulators. It's hard to be an investor as well, because there's also a very significant amount of reporting. I mean, some of our clients tell us that half of their teams spend half of the year just doing reporting rather than doing investing. And maybe that is just because there's a lot of new reporting requirements that require, the first year you report on a new data set, it's hugely difficult, and then it gets a little bit easier and the data quality improves over time. But yes, there is no doubt a huge reporting burden. Guilherme, I've been in charge of reporting against the CDP. It's a huge burden. I'm sure you know. You know, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the PRI for investors. These are, you know, significant in addition to regulatory reporting.
I'm happy to jump on this one as well.
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I think there is also an important. I see it as sort of a transition phase. I think something that is important to acknowledge is the fact that we have now started to take sustainability reporting more seriously. So therefore, we have the launching of these new, say, standards and frameworks, which is a really positive thing. And we're living through this moment where there's a lot of different initiatives taking place. But I think on the good side of things is that CDP is working really hard on the harmonization of these different standards. So our idea, as this is totally public right now, is to fully incorporate the ISSB standards, which will be sort of the global standards in this area. So they will act sort of as a baseline, but CDP will continue to implement what is sort of considered the best practice in environmental reporting, which means that we will incorporate aspects of the ESRS standards, as long as they represent the best practices. So this is our main concern, that we're always giving forward to companies and for them to implement their strategies, what is the best practice out there. And it's important to understand as well that within all of these different standards, no one is really reinventing the wheel. They all sort of follow, and we have a person here who can testify to that, but and I mean Sylvain, that they all sort of follow the guiding framework from the TCFD. So if you look at CDP's questionnaire, the modules, the TCFD modules, and the modules within the SRS, you will see that they follow a very similar structure. So don't be discouraged. Put that little extra effort. It is worth it. You know, hire that intern to fill out all the different data.
Hire that consultant as well.
Exactly. But yeah, put in the effort. It's worth it. We're living through this transition phase, and companies also need to understand that it's super important to be reporting this data on sustainability, as it was the case when the financial metrics were introduced a few years ago. So that's my key message here.
Transition phase. I think that's a key phrase and a great way to close this session. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up because we have another session coming up. I want to thank both of you for the insights. I learned a lot today. I think our audience will have as well. And of course, to our audiences, you're welcome to reach out to both Sylvain and Guilherme with any questions you may have, or to us, and we can facilitate that. Our ESG team at Kepler will be following and writing on these topics for the next year, certainly, and beyond that. So look out for that as well. And the last thing I would say is please join us in about just over 10 minutes for a very unique discussion on solving the carbon equation from the demand side. So I'm sure you will learn a lot there as well. Thank you very much, and we hope to hear from all of you soon.
Thank you, Anastasios. Thank you, Guilherme.
Thank you, Sylvain.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.